Hello and welcome to variation 38, subvariations 10 through 15. These are the sautille variations and they're very much like the sautille variations we had in subvariations of variation 34, but they're all upside down. Subvariation 10 is the same as we had in variation 34, subvariation 12, but it's upside down. Here we should have our arm position in between the two strings that we're doing the sautille on. So if we're doing it on E and A string, our arm position should be in between the two strings, with A and D string the middle position between A string position and D string position, and with D and G string the same thing, in the middle position between the D string position and the G string position. So our upper arm should have the position of both strings that we're doing the sautille on. It's a good idea to start slowly at the place where you want to do the sautille and just do one figure at first, slowly and gradually speeding it up using very little bow. You will notice as from a certain speed the bow wants to bounce, and you will notice if you do this once without allowing the bow to bounce that you have to add more weight. You have to quite consciously add quite a lot of weight to stop the bow from bouncing. This experience will tell you that the bow wants to bounce, and then all you have to do is allow it to bounce. So that's very helpful just to get a feeling for the bow wanting to bounce. You allow it to bounce. It's quite a passive bowing because it's so fast. And doing this just on one figure helps because you can completely concentrate on the bow. You don't have to worry about moving your left hand across the fingerboard. The other thing which can be a good idea is to play this slower in spiccato once. That can help quite a lot to just get used to the coordination. For the larger string crossing, going from G string to A string, it's a good idea also to do that slowly in spiccato a few times. And remember the string distance. If you go from G string to A string, the A string is nearly 2 centimeters away from the G string. You will be slightly closer to the frog. You have to know this. This helps a lot with string crossings, particularly large string crossing. And by doing this slowly in spiccato, you can become very conscious of the string distance. Make sure your string crossings are very small. You don't want them to be any bigger than they need to be. That won't work. If you feel like you're completely losing control, check out if your string crossings are perhaps too big. Your bow should almost be on both strings. It's nearly double stops. It's nearly double stops. So here we have to be very careful to have very close string crossings. Subvariation 11 is the same as we had in variation 34, subvariation 13, but again it's upside down. Here I found it very helpful to practice it slowly in spiccato a few times to get used to the coordination. This shouldn't be completely new for you if you've worked at the sub-variations of variation 34, but when one practices this one after one's done sub-variation 10, the coordination is different. So to get used to it and just to show the bow exactly what we want, it helps a lot to practice it a bit slower in spiccato at first. Then again, practice it a little bit slower with the bow on the string, using very little bow at exactly the place you want to do the sautille, taking just one figure and then gradually speeding it up until you notice the bow wanting to bounce and allow it to bounce. You'll notice as from a certain speed the bow wants to bounce and then allow it to bounce. It can also help to do this repeating one bar over and over again, starting slowly and then gradually speeding up until the bow starts bouncing on its own. This is a great way of remembering how to do the sautille, remembering the bow bouncing on its own as from a certain speed, and just by repeating one bar over and over again, you can completely concentrate on what you're doing with the bow, because you don't have to concentrate on the left hand that much yet. And once you know, okay, you can do the bowing, then you can put both hands together. Notice again, very small string crossings, very little bow. This is a very small movement. If you use too much bow when you're doing this slowly, then the bow won't start bouncing. It won't work. You have to use very, very little bow. So very, very little bow, then the bow will start bouncing. If it doesn't bounce, check out if you're perhaps adding too much weight, because as you speed up, you need to take weight away from the first finger of the bow and lean the hand towards the fourth finger. Not as much as I'm showing, but you can't add weight when you're bouncing. So if the bow doesn't bounce, check out if you are perhaps adding too much weight. That's adding too much weight. You would feel it in your first finger. So check that out and then lean the hand towards the fourth finger. This won't be visible. It's just a little bit taking the weight off of the bow stick. And then the bow will bounce. So check out if you're perhaps accidentally adding too much weight, stopping the bow from bouncing. So variation 12 is the same as we had in variation 34, sub-variation 14, but upside down again. It's a bit more balanced, so it feels less complicated, but still it's a good idea to do it a bit slower in spiccato once at first. Very close string crossings, particularly when you speed up. Very, very close string crossings. The build-up for the sautille is exactly the same as in all the other sautille variations, starting slowly at the place where you want to do the sautille using very little bow, and as you speed up, you will notice the bow wants to bounce and you allow it to bounce. Again, it helps to do just one bar, repeating over and over again. You can also start off with just doing one figure over and over again. So those are the ways you build up the sautille. Here again we have a large string crossing from the G to the A string. Do that a few times in spiccato. And remember the string distance between G string and A string. The A string will be a bit closer to the frog than the G string is. And there again, string crossings no bigger than they have to be. When you're on the G string, be as close to the D string as you can without actually playing on the D string. Very, very close string crossings is what's important here. In spite of these sautille variations being upside down compared to what we had in variation 34 in the sautille sub-variations, our arm position in this one still has to be on the higher string, and we flick the wrist up for the lower string. It's not on the lower string, and we don't flick the wrist down. We put our arm position on the higher string, very close to the adjacent string, nearly double stops. So we have the smallest possible distance. So that might just be something which can be helpful. So variation 13 is the same as we had in variation 34, sub-variation 16, but upside down again. This one is not as symmetrical, so it takes a little bit of getting used to, and practicing it a bit slower in spiccato helps a lot. After a while, you'll notice that your hand is getting used to it. When you do this, make sure you don't bounce too high. Very, very close string crossings, of course. And otherwise, the build-up of the sautille is the same as in the other sautille variations. You can start slowly on the string using very, very little bow at the place where the sautille works best, and just repeat one figure. And then just repeat one bar. The arm position has to be on the higher of the two strings, and the lower one is just done with flicking the wrist up again. So, arm position on the higher string, find that out by just playing it on the higher string a little bit. Then you have your arm position, and then for the lower string you just flick up your wrist. So here the arm position again is on the higher string. Sub-variation 14 is the same as we had in variation 34, sub-variation 15, but again, it's the upside down version. The principle is the same as we had in the previous sub-variation. Start off by playing it a little bit slower in spiccato to get used to the coordination. And then build up the sautille the same as you built it up in the other sub-variations, starting slowly with the bow on the string, using very, very little bow, and then speeding up gradually. Make sure you take weight off of the bow stick to allow the bow to bounce, and you can start with just one figure, repeating it over and over again, then move on to one bar that you repeat over and over again. The principle is exactly the same. It's always a little bit different for the bow. That's why we have all these different combinations with different string crossings in different places. But the principle is always the same. I was never quite sure of how much I should be repeating myself here, because by now definitely you will know how to build up the sautille, but I also do want these variations to be as complete as possible, so I apologize if I repeat myself too much. Here again, the arm position is on the higher string, and we just flick up the wrist for the lower string. So that's again the same as in the previous sub-variation. Sub-variation 15 is the upside down version of variation 34, sub-variation 17. This is sautille in triplets. It won't be difficult for you if you've mastered sub-variation 17 of variation 34, because the principle is exactly the same. But if it's new to you, you might need a little more time getting used to doing sautille in triplets, because we have down, and then up, down, up. So play it a bit slower in spiccato a few times first, just to get used to the new coordination. Then speed up the spiccato a little bit. The difference between spiccato and sautille is that sautille is a lot more passive. So for the sautille, the build-up is again to start on the string a little bit slower with very little bow. And as you speed up, make sure you take weight off of the bow stick, allow the bow to bounce. This is a good idea to do just on one figure at first. After a while, you'll notice the bow wants to bounce, allow it to bounce. Then you can repeat that, just repeating one bar over and over again to get used to the sautille in triplets before you move across the whole fingerboard. And it helps a lot to put an accent on the first note of this triplet, which is on the higher string. I'll show you slowly once. It's the first note of each figure. That helps a lot, and I put most of my awareness into that accent. I do quite a strong accent, and then I let the bow just do the rest. What I do is I do use my arm a little bit for that accent. Make sure wrist, hand and fingers are very relaxed, but a strong accent seemed to help me a lot. So try that out. That might also help you. In this sub-variation, I do the string crossings a little bigger. Not least so that I can do a strong accent, because I find that strong accent very helpful. So the string crossings are slightly bigger than in the other sub-variations. Not too much, of course. It won't work if they're too big. That won't work. They're still quite close, just slightly bigger so that you can give more of an accent, because you do the accent by bringing your arm down a little bit. So the string crossings are slightly bigger than in the other sub-variations. You'll have to find that out a little bit for yourself. It's not even sure if this accent really will help you. The accent helped me, but you'll have to experiment and try that out for yourself. So don't be surprised if the accent doesn't help you. Then, of course, don't do the accent. Okay, 15 sub-variations. I hope you find this useful. I apologize for repeating myself so much, because the principles are so often exactly the same, but I did want to make this as complete as possible, just in case anybody is looking for just one specific sub-variation and they might not want to check out all other sub-variations and other variations. So that was why I decided just to do it as complete as possible. I hope you enjoy doing all these sub variations. It's excellent for your bow technique. You get so flexible and you can do all kinds of bouncing bowings combined with slurs and with string crossings and all sorts of combinations. So it's really worth the work that you put into it. And I hope you enjoy it. Happy practicing.